Welcome to my teapot video. I'm going to cover all the steps of how I make a faceted teapot. I'll be throwing, trimming, faceting, bisquing, glazing. I'm doing it all. So buckle up and enjoy. I will start by laying down my wooden bat. I put a little bit of water on the bottom of there to stick it to that pad of clay under the bat and make sure it's not going to slide around while I'm working on this ball of clay. This will be for the base of my teapot, and I start just by throwing it on that bat. I'm pushing it down, making sure it's not going to fly around as I begin to cone for centering. So I'm going to start by getting that clay nice and wet, and then I'm just pushing my palms together, and the clay has nowhere to go but up. And yeah, just kind of coning up here. Then I'm going to cone down. I'm using my right fist to push that clay into my left palm as I move down. Kind of that whole motion at once, and the clay, do this a couple times and the clay should just kind of go right onto center. Now I'll start to open up my clay and prepare myself for the first pull. I'm just dragging my thumbs across and establishing the width of my base before I begin this first pull here. For my first pull, I'm not really going for too much height. I'm just trying to make sure my walls are nice and even and really set myself up for this second pull. The second pull is where I'm really trying to get a lot of height. I'm collaring the clay in here, really pushing it towards the center of that wheel, have a nice cone shape. I always try to keep my cylinder in this little cone shape and make sure the top of that cylinder isn't spreading outwards. So here's my second pull, getting a lot more height out of this one, just keeping my fingertips somewhat even and applying an even pressure and making sure that the speed of my wheel is moving, making sure that the speed of my wheel kind of coincides with how fast my hands are moving up that clay. I don't want it to move too fast. I don't want it to move too slow. If you've ever been doing a pull and your fingers just stay in one spot, you're just going to tear the clay in half. So I've got my metal rib, I'm compressing the walls, getting all the slip off of the outside, and really establishing the shape of this teapot. After I've used that metal rib on my bottom section, I'm not going to touch it anymore, and I'm just going to start collaring in the top of this teapot. At this point, it's just a series of collaring and pulling. Each time you collar, you're compressing that clay, so it's going to get a little bit thicker. So I collar, and then I pull, and then I collar, and then I pull until the walls feel even, and I have the top at an appropriate width for my lid, which will later be measured and put in there. Using my leather chamois just to smooth out that top, and I will take my calipers at this point and measure that inside width so I can match the flange of my lid, which will make more sense in a second here. Using that handy tool just to pop off that wooden bat, and I'll place it on the wear board that you cannot see. Alright, skipping around a little bit here, but I'm going to start throwing the spout. I use a ½ pound of clay for the spout, and I'll use a ½ pound for the lid. It's such a small amount of clay, I don't do much coning, I just kind of jump straight to centering. Once I feel like I got it center, I'll open up that clay. I punch straight through to the base for these, so they have a hollow bottom. I don't really know why, I've just always kind of done it like that. Start pulling up my walls, just as anything else, going through the motions, collaring, pulling, collaring, and pulling. For the spout, I always just kind of imagine that I'm throwing a narrow neck bottle. It's the same exact concept. I want to make sure it has a nice little round base, and I want to have a gradual taper to the top. It's maybe one of the most important parts of a teapot. I feel like a spout really makes or breaks the pot, and I try to keep a pretty narrow opening, just have it pretty tight up there on the top, because I want that pour to be nice and smooth. I don't want it to be spraying everywhere, water flying all over the place. I just want it to be a nice narrow opening for the water to pour out of. Along with being narrow, you want that inside lip of your spout to be pretty sharp so it cuts the water and you're not going to have any drips. I feel like the main part and function of a teapot is to be pouring out of the spout, so in my mind, it's just one of the most crucial parts of this whole process. So I will take that off the bat and let it dry. And now we're gonna work on the lid. As I'm centering these, as I'm opening up this lid, I'm keeping in mind the whole time the flange and the opening, so it just has a really nice tight fit on my actual body of the teapot. Taking the measurement from my calipers, and I kind of press them in there and leave a little mark in the clay so I can see where my flange is going to start. I've always used a wooden rib for this part, and I just make sure my clay is really nice and wet, and that rib is also nice and wet, and then I just push down on the clay until I have a flange just pretty much established. I'll cut off that excess, and it already kind of looks like a lid, an upside down lid, if you will. There's many different types of lids and flanges you can do, and this one is just my preferred way to do it. You can look at a lot of different videos and a lot of different types of lids, but that feels like one of the fun, or I guess for me, the funnest part of a teapot is that there's so many varieties and kind of ways you can go about it. Going back through here with my rib, I keep measuring my flange and seeing how big or small it is and kind of adjusting to get it the right size. I'd rather my flange be bigger than it has to be because I can always trim down that clay later to make sure it has a snug fit. Smoothing out that top, smoothing out the side there, and pop that off, and there's your lid. At this point, I'm gonna start the faceting process, which you don't have to facet your teapot. It's just kind of something that I like to do, not with all of them, but this one I was feeling it. I facet these teapots at the leather hard stage. I've found it to be the most effective and easiest way for me to do it. I'm using like a cheese slicer with a wiggle wire that I kind of attached to this cheese slicer. Having my inside hand is really beneficial because I can feel that wire at points, and I don't want to punch through the clay. I want to make sure I'm not cutting a hole in the side of it, so I'm kind of using that inside hand to guide me through that, moving nice and steady, nice and slow as I go down, and making sure when I was throwing this, I left a little bit thicker of a wall so I could anticipate cutting away some of the clay for the faceting. And pleased with that. It looks pretty nice. So I will begin the trimming of my lid. I prefer to trim these lids while they're in the pot instead of straight onto the wheel head. I center my teapot, put the lid inside. You can even put a little bit of water on the rim of your pot and really make sure that the lid is going to stick there and not move around while you're trimming these. Throw my little rear lens cap on the top to make sure I'm not going to leave any marks as I'm pushing down, distributing my weight evenly across the lid, making sure it's not going to move around while I start this trimming process. I leave a lot of excess clay in my lids, anticipating how much I'm going to be trimming away, so I can really refine the shape and ensure that it's going to make sense with the shape of my teapot. Moving a lot of clay here, just getting rid of all of that excess, lightening it up, and getting just the shape that I really want. For the most part, especially with this shape of a teapot, I'll have a really flat lid. It's not gonna, at this point it looks like it's kind of round, like it has a dome shape, but I'm just gonna remove all of that excess and just have a nice flat lid up there. I won't put a knob on top of these. I'll, I guess you'll see. You'll see how I leave them. Just continuing to trim, continuing to remove that clay. I like the consistency of these to be pretty soft, so it's just that much easier to remove the clay. I feel like everyone has their own preference of how soft or hard they want their clay while they're trimming. It really bothers me to be trimming something that's dried out for too long. I love to see ribbons. If you're trimming your pot, trimming your clay, I feel like the clay's way too hard if it's just kind of like flying off in almost a powdery form. I love the clay to be pretty soft on the softer side of leather hard while I'm doing all this. Taking my metal rib here, smoothing out that top, getting it nice and burnished and nice and smooth. And I'll use my torch just to dry out that clay a little bit, so when I take my lid off of my pot, I'm not leaving a bunch of fingerprints in that clay. I don't dry it out too much. I mainly just do this so I can handle the lid without it being too wet. Ooh, that little wispy steam smoke is really pretty. Getting sidetracked. So I trim these with a chuck. The opening is so small on the tops of these pots that a chuck is going to ensure that it's not going to collapse if I'm placing it straight onto the wheel head. The hardest part, I think, about trimming with a chuck is once you have that chuck center, you need to center your pot and make sure the base of your pot is flat and not moving up and down too much. You want to get it pretty level. And once you feel like it's somewhat level, you can still kind of see it moving around a little bit up there, but I'm not very worried about it. I throw these with a thin base, so I'm not removing too much clay from the actual base of this pot. I'm mainly just trying to clean up the sides there and bevel an edge into the bottom and make sure where I was faceting, I'm just trimming away like the roughness that the facet kind of caused during the process. Smoothing it out, use my sponge, getting that clay nice and wet, and then I'll just use my finger to kind of smooth it out. I won't take the metal rib like I usually do, but just use my fingertips. I feel like the best tool in pottery are the hands when it all comes down to it. Going back with that loop tool on the top there, mainly just to smooth it out. I'm not really taking off too much clay, as you can see. Just trying to get like a flat bottom for this thing to sit on, so whatever surface it is on, it's a level teapot. So at this point, I'm going to start pulling my handles. So by the time I have my spout attached, my handles will also be ready to be attached. I kind of forget how much clay I used here, but I want all of these little balls to be the same, so all of my handles kind of look the same. While I'm working on this one teapot, there are 5 others that I'm actually finishing, so I pull quite a bit of handles. I'm flattening out these balls into the palms of my hands, making, just giving myself something kind of flat to already start with before I start pulling these handles. I like a really flat handle. I don't like really round ones. It's all preference, but those are the ones that I like, so those are the ones that I pull. I made sure to leave a decent amount of clay at the top of these so I have a little bit of leverage while I am pulling down on these balls of clay that turn into these long handles. Each time that I'm going over, I'm kind of flipping the handle back and forth every 2, 3, 4 rotations to make sure that it's even and not thicker or thinner on one side. I want it to just all be even and make sure that clay is distributed all the way through to the end of the handle. I think, I'll do one more example here using my thumb and my pointer finger and just having a pretty light pressure. This clay was on the wetter side, so I was being a little more gentle when I was pulling down on these. So while those are drying, I'm going to start working on attaching this spout. I use this wire tool to sort of create a line on the spout, and this will give me a good idea of where it's going to be attached on my pot. Most spouts are cut at an angle, and a lot of this clay will just be discarded. I'm using this little knife tool. I think Kemper makes this tool. It's kind of like a really sharp mini fettling knife. And I'm just going back over that line that I created with my wire and cutting out the actual shape of this handle. It's helpful, I didn't really show it here, but with these spouts you can kind of hold it up to your pot and sort of like envision the spout being on there in the right angle that you'll want before you really make the cut, because once you cut these things off, there's not really any turning back. Unless you made 4 or 5 of them, then you can practice with them and set each one up to your pot until one makes sense, and then kind of pick that one. I'm just smoothing out where I made that cut with my fingers, so I have less work to do. Once I attach the actual spout to the pot, it'll already be somewhat smooth, and I don't have to fidget with it as much. Since I faceted this pot, I'm going to attach the spout with one of the facets, just using my needle tool to kind of outline where it's going to be before I poke the holes for my spout. Even though I don't use a lot of loose leaf tea, it's just a habit of mine to poke multiple holes. If you're just using tea bags, I think you can get away with cutting out one really large hole, but I poke multiple ones. So yeah, I did some scoring and slipping and did some outline of where I will be poking these holes for my spout. That's my handy little hole poker. I have 2 different ones, 2 different sizes. And these are really useful because instead of leaving like a huge mark like a noodle tool might, if you just poke it through there, it cuts out perfect little balls where you cut your holes. Applying some slip here that I stole out of my super dirty splash pan. And then I'll use my paintbrush to just dab some water onto the pot. The consistency of your spout, like with anything, you just want it to match the consistency of the pot that you're working on. Sorry, stumbling all my words here. I try to work with the spouts on more of the wet side because it's just easier to mold it and kind of shape it and squish the clay around and get it like a nice, really nice looking seam between your spout and your actual pot. Pushing down on each side with my fingers. A lot of the work here, I'm just kind of using my fingers. I don't use too many tools when I'm connecting these spouts, but as you can see here, I'm going back over with the paintbrush, and that is the one tool that I'll use to kind of smooth out the seam there. I'll just dab some water on that paintbrush and just kind of paint over it and use my finger to smooth out any of the grog that I might have pulled out of the clay. This wasn't really planned, but I decided the top of my spout, where my spout ended, was a little bit too high, and I didn't really like how it looked, so I'm using a method here. I'm just going to cut off the very top of it to have the spout be flat with the top of my pot. You can see here I'm using that fettling knife to really just make sure it's nice and flat there where I cut off that excess piece of spout. This is a great method on, the chance that your spout is a little bit too tall. Ideally, you want the end of your spout to match up with the top of your teapot because that's where the water level is going to be. As high as your spout ends is how much water you can fill up your teapot, if that makes sense. And you want to get as much water / tea in there as you can. So yeah, I just cut off the top where roughly the top of my teapot ended. Now I'm ready to attach this handle. I will cut off that top excess, the part of the handle I was holding onto. I was pulling it. I cut that part off to get the desired length. Now I'll do a little bit of scoring and slipping, attaching my handle directly opposite of where my spout is. And just kind of looking at the side of it, seeing where this thing's going to line up, where it's going to make the most sense. Trying to make sure I can fit at least 2 or 3 fingers into this handle. And you know, judging on the length of your handle, it's going to be how big it is, how many fingers you can fit in there once it's all done. Using my inside hand to kind of brace it and make sure I'm not like deforming the pot too much as I'm squishing the handle into place. And it's pretty secure on there at this point. I'm just gonna go over the edges of it, kind of blocking the whole view of, of me actually doing that, sorry. But I'm just smoothing out that connection and making sure it's just a nice transition between the top of that handle and the top of my teapot. At this point, I'm kind of holding it at eye level and moving it to where it makes sense, to where I have like that nice curve, that nice kind of loop of a handle that you desire, or I desire, or whoever's holding this pot desires. Now that I have the bottom attached, I can go back over and smooth out that transition between the handle and the pot. I wet my finger a little bit, get a little bit of water on there, and then I just follow the curve of the top of that handle and follow it down into the pot, so it just has a nice smooth transition between the two. While I'm doing this, I'm kind of shaping the handle a little bit too, kind of pulling up, pulling out. It's still pretty malleable at this point and has some play to it, which I want, because I want to be able to shape this thing and really finalize it while it's on the teapot. If you let your handle dry out too much and it's too leather hard, it's going to crack while you're trying to shape it. Get my handy potter's stamp, my maker's mark there, and I just press it into the bottom of that handle, and that also just ensures that it's really on there. It's really not going to go anywhere. It's attached. It's a handle. It's a teapot. And it's pretty much done. All that I have left to do is poke a hole into the lid to make sure that the tea, the water, the lemonade, I don't know, whatever you put in your, just to make sure that liquid's going to pour out of the spout without a vacuum effect happening. The hole allows air in to allow your liquid to pour out in a nice, even fashion. So there's the teapot. I'm going to let it sit out for 2 or 3 days and get bone dry. And then I will load up the Bisque kiln, which is happening right now. There's my kiln. It is a Scut 1227. It fits a decent amount of pots. I think it's got maybe 10 cubic feet, 9 or 10 cubic feet. And I fire this thing up to cone 6. For this Bisque, your pots can touch, all the clay can touch, so I just pack it as tight as possible. And I will fire this to cone 05. Some people Bisque to cone 04, some people Bisque to cone 06. I go right in the middle at a cone 05, firing on a slow setting. There's my cat, there's Otto, he's cute, I love him, he's soft, he likes to get involved in everything I do, and that's okay. He's a cat, he's curious. So I pressed in my settings, I did everything, the kiln has fired, it's probably 2 days later, and it's cool enough for me to unload. These pots are at the Bisque stage, meaning most of the water has been released. They've been fired to a point where they're porous, they're also strong, they can accept glaze, and yeah, it's a bisque pot, it's a biscuit pot. I've been dabbling with a little bit of once fire, single fire, and I haven't quite figured, I need to adjust my glazes a little bit more to feel comfortable doing that. So for now, I'm still going to bisque my pots because they absorb glaze a lot better than a greenware pot does. I kind of explained it in a different video, but I like to think of a bisque pot as a sponge without any water, except stronger than a sponge. It can still absorb water, it can still absorb glaze, but not so much that the material will dissolve. It has passed quartz inversion, so it's strong, but it's also still fragile. Strong enough to take on a glaze and not dissolve, but also porous enough to absorb the water in the glaze and make sure that it really adheres to the outside and forms that nice thickness of a glaze that you are looking for. Once I've got this kiln all unloaded, I will begin to wax the bottoms of these so they're not sticking to my kiln shelves and so the lids aren't sticking to the pots. I've got my handy reed wax here. I've added a little bit of food coloring just so I can tell the difference between the wax and the color of clay when I'm dealing with like porcelain or a white clay body. So I'll start out by getting this pot centered, and I wax the lids first. I place them on the top of the pot, kind of tap them onto center, as centered as I can. And when I'm applying the wax to these lids here, I'm just applying the wax to the outside of the flange and to that bottom lip of the lid. I want the inside of my flange to have glaze on it just because the wear and tear of the water from steeping the tea, the moisture going up to the top of this pot, I feel like it's just going to make it a lot stronger, and aesthetically it's pleasing to the eye to have a little bit of glaze in that part of it. Wherever your wax is, glaze is not going to be. That's kind of the theory here. I do not want these lids to be sticking to my teapots as I'm firing them, because I do fire these with the lids in the pot. Applying some wax to the lip of this actual teapot because I don't want any glaze to be on the lip of this thing. I also don't want to spend a bunch of time wiping any glaze off, so I prefer to wax them. It's also important to note that wherever this wax is, glaze will not be. And really the only way, if you drip wax on a pot and you don't want it there, the only real way to get rid of that is by bisquing your pot again, which is annoying. I'm sanding. I have that little piece of sandpaper there. I'm just sanding out some of the, there was still some rough parts on the underside of that lid. So I just use that little piece of fine grit sandpaper to get rid of those bumps. So now that my pots are all waxed, they are ready to be glazed. I'm using this pebble glaze. I know it said Celadon on the top there, but that's a lie. I just haven't changed it because I'm lazy. This is a pebble glaze that I mixed up. It has a decent amount of iron in it, and some rutile, and some other magical things. Use my drill there to get it all mixed up, make sure it's at the consistency that I want. Kind of like a heavy whipping cream is what I prefer. And I'm just pouring that glaze on the inside, making sure as I'm turning this teapot, I'm getting the inside fully coated with that glaze. Teapots are so much fun to glaze because you get to use your spouts immediately. I will turn it to the point where it hits my spout, blocking your whole view there. Sorry about that, my curls. But I twisted it all around until the glaze poured out of the spout. I'll wipe the excess off of there, and then I'll immediately dunk the outside of my pot. I hold it in the glaze for about 4 or 5 seconds until I feel like I have a nice layer on the outside of this thing and it's absorbed a decent amount of the glaze. These pots are so thin because I faceted them that the thinner the wall, the wetter it's going to be from pouring that glaze on the inside, so the longer I will hold it to make sure the outside really has absorbed a lot of that glaze. Using my tongs for my lid, I just do a full dip because I waxed these lids, and that's a benefit of waxing. I can just dip the whole thing in there, and like magic, that glaze is just gonna bounce right off where I don't want it. There is that. I'm not too worried about excess drips on these. With some of my glazes, the the drips, it's always going to be a little bit thicker where a drip is on your pot. And based on how much clay you have in your glaze, based on a few different things, those drips can really stand out. I don't really mind them. I think it gives it more of a depth. I think it gives it a handmade feel, and yeah, I kind of like the drips. They're fun. They're nice for me. Gives the pot a little more character. I'm using my finger to feather the glaze, which is to say I'm just lightly rubbing the top of it, getting any air bubbles, getting any little pinholes, any imperfections out of the surface of the glaze before I fire it. If you've ever had a glaze that has really pinholed and pitted a lot, feathering the outsides of your pots and wiping any little abrasions or bumps out before you glaze them can really help you. It adds some time, but it's worth doing in the long run. So now I'm loading up this glaze kiln, making sure these pots are not going to be touching each other, but I want them close enough that I can maximize the space in my kiln. This is a total game of Tetris. I think this one in particular took me an hour to load because I kept switching things around. I was trying to optimize my space, and at the same time I wanted to be at least 2 inches away from that thermocouple to not confuse it, to not make the temperature any, less accurate than maybe it already could be. I've always been taught you want at least 2 inches in every direction around your thermocouple. I can push that sometimes, 1.5 inches, I don't know. But I try to respect the rules as much as I can. Every little centimeter counts, really pushing these things around, trying to fit this bowl without actually touching my soft brick and my elements. Some glazes will have a tendency to off-gas, so if they're really close to each other, different pots can kind of off-gas and leave little exhaust fumes, if you want to think about it that way, onto other pots surrounding them. Luckily, none of my glazes do this. I know chrome has a real tendency to off-gas, but I'm not using too much of that here, so I'm not worried about it. Now that I've got my kiln all loaded up, I am ready to fire this thing for the last time before these pots are done. Giving it one more look around, making sure nothing's touching so none of these pots stick to each other. I really do not want that to happen. Close the lid. I've got all my peeps plugged up. You can see that exhaust tube back there. That's my vent. So I plug up all my peeps. If you don't have a vent, you usually leave that top peep open so any fumes can still escape. Punched all the buttons. I'm firing this to cone 6 with an 8-minute hold at a medium speed. Just like magic, the kiln is all done. It's all fired. I let it cool until, I think about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And then I will open up the top. I don't want to open it up while it's too hot because I don't want anything to crack and I don't want any crazing to happen. So I try to do my diligence and I try to not peak too early, which I don't always do. This was a good firing. I was really pleased with it. I had just mixed a lot of these glazes fresh, so there was just a real nice color to everything, a real nice evenness, and I was really pleased with how a lot of these pots turned out. There's a lot of vases in here, a lot of bigger pieces. Those are fermentation crocks, these things. These lids kind of stuck, which they will, so I'll use the end of my hammer, a little piece of wood, to ping on it until I hear that lid separate from the pot. I try to be pretty gentle. I don't want to break anything, but it gives it the little push that it needs to separate. Funky little vase, a few more funky vases. I haven't glazed any, or really done any glaze firings or made any big pots in a while, so it was pretty fun to load up some bigger vases into this kiln. There are my little teapots sitting there in the middle. With these kilns, especially these electric kilns and all kilns, just in general, the tops mostly going to be the hot part. The bottom's going to be the cooler part. That's just how heat works. And in the middle there, right next to the thermocouple, that's where your temperature is being read. It tends to be pretty hot too. And I was pleased with how all these teapots came out. They glazed really pretty. I used my trusty hammer there, that piece of wood again, to separate the lid and just give it the little push that it needed to get that lid off of there. All my little teapots sitting in a row, sitting all pretty. Waiting for some tea, waiting for whatever you want to put in them. It's always the most satisfying part to unload a glaze kiln, and if I can have 90% of my pots, 90 to 80% turnout, then that is a huge success in my mind. I'm using this valve grinding compound. This is such a pro tip. That raw part of your clay, there's going to be grog. It's going to be a little more rough, and this valve grinding compound will smooth out all of that roughness. It gives it such a pretty feel when it's in that flange. It just rotates so smoothly, like butter. I love it. I always use this stuff on any of my lids, whether it's a jar or a teapot. I use a little bit of water. You don't need much of this compound. I just take a dab and I dab it around, and then I use the water to disperse it. This lid in particular, this one kind of warped, and it was really giving me a lot of trouble, and the valve grinding compound completely saved it. I just twist it around for, I don't know, I guess as long as it takes to feel like it's running smoothly, to feel like, there's no friction, there's no real resistance, and that'll all depend. You'll feel it once it kind of stops. It grinded away just enough of that roughness and just enough of any warpage that was in there to fit really nice and snug, which was great because I was worried it would not be saved, but I saved it, and it's okay. Here's my faceted teapot that you've been following along with. Use my valve grinding compound on this as well. Get it nice and smooth. That thing's running on there real good. I'm pleased with that. I'll take these all over to the sink and just rinse off any of that excess compound. It comes off really easy. It's this one in particular, it's water based, so yeah, it just rinses right off of there. Make sure you get the water based one. I think there might be an oil based one. You do not want the oil based one. I will do a little test here, a little pour test, and see how we do. That's looking nice. It's looking ready for some tea. I'm pleased with that. I'm pleased with this teapot. The glaze really broke beautifully with those facets, that dark clay shine through, and yeah, it was great. I was really happy with this. There's my teapot, there's my tutorial. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. I hope you are all doing well, and please like and subscribe. Thanks, bye.